Hello, Madam Prime Minister Suminwa.
Hello, Roger Muntu.
How is your country, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, doing today? Since the beginning of the year, events have been particularly intense. We have all been following the security situation in the east of the country, the discussions and initiatives here at the United Nations, as well as the various diplomatic and humanitarian challenges. In fact, Prime Minister, would you say that this has been a particularly busy period for your government?
Votre question m'a un peu fait hésiter au début en disant comment se porte le pays.
Your question made me hesitate a bit at first. How is the country doing? One thing is certain, the start of the year has been very intense for the government. You know, at the end of last year we had the Washington agreements, so we had to quickly put a monitoring system in place to ensure that, on our part, we were fulfilling our commitments.
Nous allons respecter ce pourquoi nous nous sommes engagés. Et donc, il y a tout un suivi, tous les mécanismes de suivi qui sont mis en place.
So there is a whole monitoring process with various oversight mechanisms in place, and we had to ensure they were operational and so on. At the same time, the war situation remains a cause for concern, because not only did we have Security Council resolutions 2773 calling for a ceasefire under the Washington agreements, but we also revisited the issue of the ceasefire on the ground. The reality is different because Rwanda, along with the M23/AFC, has not only continued to send troops back into the field, but has also continued its attacks.
Sur le terrain, mais a attaqué. On a eu Uvira qui était tombé. Là, on a pu récupérer Uvira.
We had Uvira, which had fallen and which we were able to retake. And that's all. So that is the full scope of the security problem we are still facing. A problem that involves the realities of war and humanitarian crises, affecting the entire population, particularly women. Because, as you know, today in our country, in the occupied areas, rape has been used as a weapon of war. I'm not the one saying this. It's confirmed by numerous reports. And these are situations we're forced to monitor closely.
Ce sont des situations que nous sommes obligés de suivre particulièrement. Nous avons tous ces déplacés-là pour lesquels nous avons...
We have all these displaced people we've had to assist, particularly those who've been displaced abroad, to countries like Burundi and Tanzania. The DRC has had to intervene directly with the UNHCR to ensure that adequate care is available on the ground for these displaced populations. This is no easy task. And as I always say, this war situation forces us to incur considerable expenses on security and the military. If we were not in this situation, we could have devoted all these funds to development. And that is why, just like the head of state, I call for peace, because we need this peace to fully develop our country and to alleviate the suffering of the population. Because this is completely unacceptable. That there are so many deaths. We're talking about millions of deaths. We have more than 5 to 6 million internally displaced people. This is completely unacceptable. It must stop. So we are continuing with this diplomatic approach.
On a plus de 5 à 6 millions de déplacés internes. C'est quelque chose de tout à fait inacceptable et donc il faut que ça cesse. Mais pour ça, nous continuons donc.
We remain positive. We have not been defeated. I believe the Congolese people are resilient, and we will continue to fight for our country's sovereignty and territorial integrity. But more than that, we are fighting for this people.
Plus encore, nous nous battons pour cette population.
Alors, à l'occasion, Madame la Première ministre, de la 70e...
So, during the 71st session of the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women here in New York, we saw you take the floor to highlight the progress made, but also the persistent challenges regarding gender equality, peace, and development. In your speech, Madam Minister, you mentioned the violence, you had just spoken about it, suffered by women in eastern DRC due to conflicts involving Rwanda and rebel groups. What support do you expect from the international community to better protect women and girls in these regions? Because apparently, when we sometimes hear from the United Nations or other Western countries, they rush to provide aid to this country. Do you expect more aid, or do you not see anything like that happening?
ils sont en train d'injecter de l'aide dans ce pays. Mais vous attendez plus d'aide ou vous voyez rien de tout ça?
Je pense qu'aujourd'hui, on en appelle à une responsabilité collective. Pourquoi? Parce que l'aide humanitaire, on en a toujours besoin, elle est importante.
I think that today we're calling for collective responsibility because humanitarian aid is always needed. It's important. But for humanitarian aid to reach people, we need to ask, what's the best way to get there? Isn't it an area free of conflict and war? And so it is entirely the responsibility of the international community today to ensure that, following the Washington agreements, I think the challenge was to ask ourselves, did many people ask themselves, is this the end? The agreements have been signed. Will peace be restored overnight? It's true that this is a process, and we're following it closely. A ceasefire was called, but it wasn't respected at all by Rwanda and its M23/AFC militias. Now, we've called for a number of sanctions. As you may have noticed recently, sanctions have been imposed on the Rwandan Defense Forces, RDF, as well as certain high-ranking officers, and I think we're expecting even more because we need to compel those who have decided.
Ainsi que certains hauts gradés. Et je pense que nous attendons encore plus parce que il faut contraindre
Exactly, sanctions that you have been calling for.
Of course. Yes, we've been calling for them for several years, and today we've started to see them take effect. There have been others, certain individuals, yes, they must continue. The pressure absolutely must continue. Because we, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, are on our own territory. We are a legitimate government with an elected president. And it is unacceptable for a neighboring country to decide, for reasons of illegal resource exploitation or territorial expansion, to come and take over land that does not belong to it.
Is this a victory for the Suminwa government?
Je pense que
it is a diplomatic victory to be credited to the President of the Republic and the Suminwa government that supports him, of course, along with our Minister of State for Foreign Affairs and his entire team, as well as all those who, in one way or another, were involved in the discussions and negotiations.
d'une manière ou d'une autre ont été partie prenante dans les discussions, dans les négociations.
Effectivement. Alors,
Indeed. So, Minister, you highlighted the 2016 reform of the Family Code, which eliminated certain discriminatory provisions, notably spousal consent. How has this reform concretely changed the lives of women in the DRC?
en RDC.
Vous imaginez que jusque en 2016, une femme, pour pouvoir travailler, devait obtenir l'autorisation maritale écrite de manière officielle. Pour pouvoir voyager, obtenir un visa, devait avoir cette autorisation maritale. Et donc, en termes de...
Can you imagine that until 2016, in order for a woman to work, she had to obtain official written spousal consent to travel? To get a visa, she had to have that spousal consent. And so, in terms of women's empowerment, I think that was still a barrier. Now, today, a woman can work without having to endure that constraint, and she can truly, how should I put it, empower herself and give free rein to all her professional ambitions. And I think that's something important. Now, of course, we must ensure that these women have access to education and training that will allow them to acquire the necessary knowledge so they can also take on certain roles. Or simply be entrepreneurs and be able to work. Because even for starting a business, you needed that spousal consent. Yes, if you want to register a business, you need spousal consent. Otherwise, it won't go through. Today, that's no longer the case. So I think this is something commendable for the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and with the president who is now the champion of positive masculinity.
De louable pour la République démocratique du Congo, et avec le président Tshisekedi aujourd'hui, le champion de la masculinité positive, ben ouais.
Well, yes, the proof is there. For the first time since our independence, we've had our first female prime minister. So that means that all the legal reforms that were enacted are now having an impact because, well, there are also men and women in place to implement everything these laws.
We were talking about the president's leadership, always under the president's leadership. Women's participation, as you say, in decision-making spheres has risen from 21%, to be more precise, from 21% in 2021 to 32% in 2024. And so far, by the way, congratulations.
So far, we've stayed the course. We hope to go even higher.
That's my question. What policies have enabled this progress, Madam Prime Minister, and how do you plan to go even further?
Je pense que non seulement pour les femmes qui sont déjà là dans le système qui existe.
Well, I think that not only for the women who are already in the system, who are already there and in the professional world, it's about being able to identify them. A number of databases have been set up, notably with certain United Nations agencies, to create a directory of women. All of this has been done on a case-by-case basis, perhaps not perfectly, but a number of women have been identified, and the most important thing now is to make ourselves known and then get our names out there. There are many initiatives today regarding women's leadership and training programs offered to women, especially those entering politics. Because I think the most important thing now is to break through that glass ceiling that some women were afraid to challenge. Now we can show that we can do it. And the other thing that's most important is really how, through education, we push women to go much further. And also because we're in a time when technology is advancing further and further. We're in the midst of an energy transition and so on. We need to encourage women to pursue STEM fields, technical, technological, and scientific studies. Because that's the future. That's the future, artificial intelligence. Yes, yes, and we need to ensure we have women in those fields as well. And I think that's the direction we're heading in, particularly with programs currently being revised at the Ministry of Education. But this work must also be done at the higher education level, because even in higher education, we need to channel students towards sectors that are truly promising for our country's development.
Pour qu'on aille vers vraiment les secteurs porteurs pour le développement de notre pays.
And we're talking about these women, these girls. It's Women's History Month, of course. You are, once again, the first woman to hold the office of Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. What message, Madam Prime Minister, do you wish to convey to young Congolese girls through your leadership? Indeed, that encourages these girls and women much more.
C'est juste de démontrer que rien n'est impossible. On peut y arriver, mais il faut travailler. Il faut travailler dur parce que ce n'est
It just goes to show that nothing is impossible. You can make it happen, but you have to work at it. You have to work hard because it doesn't come easily. It's not a given. It's not going to fall from the sky. But it's a recognition of the work that's been done. I think that for me, for example, it's been quite a journey. Ever since childhood, with parents who pushed me to go to school, I had to get the best grades. And they also taught me not to give up after a failure, but rather to pick myself up and move forward. And I think that's the lesson of failure. We learn from it. In fact, you shouldn't see failure as the end of the road. On the contrary, you have to use failure as an opportunity to learn and bounce back and move forward. And that's what women need to remember, especially young women. Don't hesitate to educate yourself and get training. And whatever the field, I'm saying not everyone is meant to go to college. That's why, in fact, there's so much talk today about vocational training. There are trades we need today, and if we don't pay attention, we'll end up with a shortage of skilled workers for a number of trades, whether it's plumbing, carpentry, and so on. These are the trades we need to develop today, particularly in construction. But as we say today with artificial intelligence, there are ways to do much more with less. All of these are things we absolutely must work on and integrate into our educational programs. And I think this will be just as beneficial for girls as it is for boys. But girls, for their part, won't be left behind because they've seen that others before them have succeeded, and we can see that happening. But why not?
arriver à aller loin.
Effectivement, ça encourage beaucoup plus ces filles et ces femmes,
Madam Prime Minister, allow me to ask this question. So, we've seen that Mr. Antonio Guterres, who is nearing the end of his final term as Secretary General of the United Nations, has led many to call for the organization to be led by a woman for the first time. What do you think of that idea, first of all? And why not you? Because you also want to set an example for these young girls who are watching.
We'll see. I always say we'll see exactly what the future holds. I believe that for me, the most important thing is the results we can achieve today for the development of our country. For me, that's what matters.
This is New York, Madam Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.